So we're back. It's Security Weekly News, episode 216. Welcome to the week of 12 June 2022. I hope you enjoyed RSA last week, if you were there in person or even if you're watching it virtually. Today we've got Internet Explorer, Vytal, SeaFlower, Metasploit, crypto declines, Linux malware, child IDs, and the Floppotron, along with Al Grease and Jason Wood on this episode of the Security Weekly News.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals.
We interrupt our program to bring you this important message.
It's the show that keeps you up to date on the latest security news twice a week. Your trusted source for accurate security information and expert analysis. It's time for Security Weekly News.
Right now, everybody is talking about cryptocurrency, and the cyber criminals are hiding in the conversation. Cyber criminals use social engineering loaded with urgency and fear to successfully prey on your company, your employees, and your customers. Spear phishing is just one of the 13 types of email threats. Barracuda has identified 13 types and shows you how you can protect your company, your customers, and your reputation. Find out about the 13 email threat types and Barracuda email protection by going and getting your free ebook at securityweekly.com/Barracuda. That's securityweekly.com/Barracuda.
Monitoring and maintaining compliance is a never-ending struggle with a high price of failure. Firemon helps customers meet complex and varying compliance requirements. Firemon has fully customizable reporting, analytics, assessments, and dashboards to meet the compliance needs of any organization. With Firemon, compliance reports take a tenth of the time, and real-time continuous compliance eliminates the anxiety and headaches of audit preparation. Improve security outcomes by improving security operations with Firemon. Visit securityweekly.com/Firemon to learn more.
All right, I'm Doug White, and it's the Security Weekly News. Well, Microsoft Explorer rides off into the sunset tomorrow. Yep. The iconic Chrome installer was what I called it, was first launched in August of 1995 and lasted just about 27 years, which makes it essentially the oldest browser platform, I guess, that's still in existence. I mean, do you remember the internet in 1995? Some of you probably weren't born. Some of us remember it. Some people were around and going, what? What is that? Pepperidge Farm remembers. But anyway, support for Explorer ends on Wednesday for the old boy. So pay your respects one last time by opening it up and installing some other browser, just for old time's sake. Anyway, the product, so Internet Explorer 11, which is the current version, will be disabled and replaced with Edge, which will be an automatic redirect after you update your system on Windows 10, I think, and Windows 11. So very shortly, even if you click Internet Explorer, you're going to end up in Internet Edge or whatever they call it. But this will affect, so the reason I reported this story at all, other than the nostalgia value, was it will affect desktop apps that rely on Explorer components or Windows that were windowed via Explorer. And so there are downloaded apps that were obtained via the semi-annual channel and other sources that are all listed in the article. So if your company is using some of those things, you may want to make sure that you're not going to run into trouble. Windows 7 ESU, Windows 8.1, and all the other versions of Windows 10, ITSC client, IoT, and server versions will continue to have it available, but Windows 11 will not. So it's like gone from Windows 11. They did say that they would continue to provide security updates until the Windows version it is on is no longer supported, which means that you'll still see it on like crashed machines at airports and things for a long time. But, this has actually been coming since 2020 when Microsoft announced plans to end support for Explorer, and they started encouraging people to move to their new browser called Edge, which is Chromium-based. There is an Explorer mode in Edge, which you can enable, which will allow some backwards compatibility for websites and things. Although I have used Edge when stuff wouldn't run in other browsers, and it did work pretty well. It does say that it will continue to be supported until 2029. So they have a pretty long, horizon for all that stuff. And of course, there's still people running Windows XP and probably Windows 3.1. Speaking of browsers, there's a new Google Chrome extension, which is called Vytal, Vytal. And this, I don't think this is actually in production, but it may be beta. And of course, I guess if you have beta on stuff that comes off GitHub, but Basically, Vytal is used to suppress your geographic location data from your browser. Now, you may be saying, well, I use a VPN for that because the VPN lets me hide my location. And, a lot of people do that for various reasons, like if you want to, say, watch Netflix in China, or you want to watch programs that are restricted on various platforms, that say, sorry, that's not available in this location. You hop on the VPN and set it to a different endpoint, and all of a sudden it's available. But they are getting around that. Sometimes people use that, of course, so people won't track you or they won't know where you are. But JavaScript functions, which are on your system and in your browser, can be used to directly query your browser, which is always trying to figure out where you are, right? I mean, I have all that stuff turned off, but my browser's constantly going, allow them to know your location. I'm like, no, they don't need to know that. Apparently, there's a lot of different objects in the browser that contain geographic information or pieces of geographic information like time zone that can be used to determine if there's a conflict between what your IP says you are and what your browser says you are, and so on and so forth. So a lot of people trying to use that. Vytal was listed on the Y Combinator Hacker News asking for testing, and it claims that it will allow you to spoof your time zone, your locale, your geolocation, your user agent in Chrome. So it probably doesn't suppress the information as much as it just basically makes it, match or spoofs it. And I've certainly seen this lately, that even with the VPN, the app says the content's not available in your location. So they're probably doing something like this with time zone. The article does have a demonstration of how they got around the VPN endpoint data information and found that with local browser data. So you can check that out. I don't know if I would install an extension like this currently until it's been vetted some more, but it does make an awfully good point if you're trying to hide your location. SeaFlower is an operation that was identified by Confiant back in March. It was called the most technically sophisticated threat targeting Web3 users after the infamous Lazarus Group. Basically, the operation is they cloned a bunch of cryptocurrency apps, and we have some other stories about that this week, but they cloned some cryptocurrency apps, and of course, by cloning them, they're identical to the real crypto apps. So they look the same, they work the same, they have the same logins and everything else, but they added a Trojan into the app, kind of like a lot of Wear stuff. And if you have that Trojan installed, one of the features of it was it could grab the security phrase that you're putting in to access your digital wallet. The report says that the SeaFlower actors appear to be Chinese-based, based on hints in the code, the services they're using, et cetera, and all the different components in this campaign. The apps were spread through legitimate postings in some cases, SEO poisoning, and other SEO techniques for people looking for crypto managers. In one of the examples for MetaMask, which was in this article, which is an iOS tool, the Trojan activated when the app was installed, and it grabs the seed phrase that you're putting into the app before it gets encrypted, so they have a record of it. That phrase then gets exfiltrated to a domain that looks a lot like the actual domain. In this case, it was MetaNask instead of MetaMask. So they obviously took a lot of pains to try to make this work. There's a lot more detail in the article if you're interested in how this code works, but basically, as ever, the advice is to be careful when you download things, especially any kind of financial apps that may be used, because even if it looks, feels, and acts like the real thing, it could still be something that's just been cloned. So, and pretty much any other app for that matter. Metasploit 6.2.0 has been released with 138 new modules, 148 new features and improvements, and 156 bug fixes since 6.1 was released back in August of 2021. The current version of Metasploit has 864 payloads, 2,227 exploits that all can be used in your pen testing framework. Rapid7, the owner of Metasploit, described some of the new features in the article. So if you want a full listing, it was all in this article I attached. Some of them included a capture plugin, which will streamline credential grabbing. I thought this one was quite interesting. Basically, they have 13 different services in there that are trying to capture various credentials off your network. They had an SMBv3 server support, debugging for Meterpreter sessions, and so forth. So there's a whole lot of stuff. Definitely worth checking out if you're a Metasploit user, or if you're interested in Metasploit. They had a lot of new stuff in that version. Well, crypto, and I should have probably put the story before that last one, but crypto was supposed to be the next big thing, right? And then it wasn't, and then it was, and then it wasn't, and then Elon tweeted something, and it was, and then Elon tweeted something else, and then it wasn't again. Yeah, it got complicated. But there was a lot of stories about this stuff this week in the general spiraling down of the market. CoinBase, which is a major crypto platform, announced this morning that they are planning to lay off 18% of their staff, which represents about 1,100 employees, and this came out in an SEC filing. A lot of cryptocurrency has been reaching its all-time lows, and Bitcoin, which is obviously the one that's most ubiquitous, fell 13% just yesterday, and Ethereum fell 17% yesterday. BlockFi, Gemini, and Crypto.com have also been announcing layoffs lately. Basically, it seems there's a lot of concern about crypto. Wow, understatement of the month. I think the rapid and uncontrolled growth of various types of coins, the potential to lose everything, the fraud, the fakery, et cetera, and the fact that, and I know not all the coins are fake and not all the coins are fraudulent, but there are plenty that are. But and of course, add to that the fact that some of these exchanges are not secure, and you lose all your money. And basically all of this is the equivalent of putting your money into a burlap bag and hiding it in your mattress, except that there's a lot of rats in the room and they like to eat money. So while you're laying on your lumpy rat mattress, listening to the happy crunching of the rats eating your life savings, well, there's really not a good outcome here. So I had a lot of excitement about crypto when it first showed up, but I also had a lot of concerns, and I was very wary of it. I'm not sure what the future holds for crypto here, but if you're still holding all those stink coins or dirty nickels, well, you might not want to exactly count on that being your retirement plan. Celsius has just announced that they are suspending withdrawals. So it's kind of got into that bank run a la 1929 kind of thing. Maybe it's a good time to buy Swiss francs and shotgun shells. I don't know, but who knows? Well, remember when people used to say that Linux was safe from malware because it was not targeted, and I just laughed and laughed and laughed. I used to love hearing people say that. It was kind of like the same people that today, like the OT people that are always like, oh yeah, we're never going to get targeted. Yeah, well, Linux was the same way, and for years and years, people, oh, we don't need to worry about Linux because hackers use Linux. They'll never go after Linux. Yeah, right. But anyway, a new Linux malware, which is called Symbiote, was found last November by the BlackBerry Research and Intel team. They published their material last week about this particular piece of malware, which is quite interesting. Apparently, the malware started as an attempt to target the financial sector in Latin America, and that was the primary thing. And it's called Symbiote because it apparently parasitically infects processes, and by doing that, it really stays below the radar because unlike an actual process that's running, even if it's named something hard to figure out, this thing is somehow running in other processes, and it basically exfiltrates credentials. It can install rootkits, and it acts as a backdoor Trojan. So, of course, once they have your credentials, they can use the backdoor Trojan to get into the server. And since these servers are often financial or other types of servers, it's a pretty scary thing. The malware itself is not a standalone executable or a script, but it's a shared object library that then gets loaded into all your running processes, and it acts kind of like a symbiote, hence the name. But it basically then uses those processes as its base, and it's not going to be easy to detect. So the purpose seems to be primarily to get credentials and access to financial servers. So watch out for that, and stop telling people that Linux is immune. Now, I was talking about this with my daughter the other day, and I saw this story about this very thing. So I don't know if you remember this or not, but there used to be this tactic where you could get a real fake ID by finding someone's name who died as a child. I know that's dark, but I watch Doctor Who. Come on, but you could use that birth certificate that you requested from some rural hospital somewhere. as a basis to get a driver's license. So for this is an old, tactic, a social engineering kind of tactic. Well, we were talking about how using children's identities was useful because it wouldn't be noticed for a long time. Because when people do identity theft and they steal some adult's identity and they immediately start getting all these notices or rejected for credit cards and whatever, you check into it. But a child, you wouldn't expect this. So, I mean, like one time, a long time ago, we got a credit card offer for Mr. Cat, RIP, and decided to see if we could actually send this credit card application in and get a credit card that said Mr. Cat on it. Yeah, it worked. That was back in the heyday of the just, hey, take money. But anyway, if somebody gets your child's social security number and then parlays that into an identity, well, you may not notice that until your child is 18 years old and goes out to buy a car or tries to get a loan. So some of the symptoms in this article are useful. One of them was, of course, that you get credit card offers for your child's name in the mail. We noticed that a long time ago and actually looked into it. But there's any kind of unusual material coming in that's directed at your children, especially if they're pretty young children. You may want to look into that. I mean, not to create a whole worry fest about it, but it might be nice info for some of your people if you're interested in that. Well, he's considered one of the greatest regurgitators of all time. Even Chris Angel had to run from the room when he produced a live owl from his esophageal tract. Not since Haji Ali has anyone been able to do such astounding tricks using only the ability to hold things in their esophagus and a little owl grease. Here is Jason Wood.
Hey, everybody. It's good to be back with you this week. This article comes actually from the Register, and then I followed it over to a blog post by Orca Security. Basically, focusing on a issue that series of vulnerabilities with a Microsoft Azure service that had some vulnerabilities with it, and Orca Security and Tenable are both taking Microsoft to task for how long it took to fix a fairly serious vulnerability that basically allowed access to other customers' data, basically crossing that boundary from my data in the cloud to your data in the cloud and everybody else's. So, it was interesting for a couple of reasons to me. First, you've got a pretty good overview of what happened in the Register article as to the response from Microsoft and basically how they actually did this response and some of the impact of it. And the second really that I enjoyed was Orca's blog post, which got into the technical details of how they took a initial vulnerability and turned it into a really large one as far as access to data. So to start off with, we'll just take a look at the Register article. Orca, basically security was doing some research on a Azure product called Azure Synapse Analytics, and was looking at this, and they found this vulnerability that basically took Microsoft 3 updates to, as far as the public reports go, to fix it. The vulnerability was discovered on January 4th, was reported to Microsoft then, eventually was designated CVE 29972. Microsoft released an update to Azure Synapse later in March, so let's say about a month and a half there before the patch was out. Unfortunately, Orca took a look at it again, or fortunately, depending on how you want to look at this, took a look at it again and immediately bypassed the fix and notified Microsoft that, hey, you have a problem on March 30th. Then in April, Orca looks at it and says, hey, Microsoft, by the way, as part of this vulnerability chain, we got access to this client certificate that allowed us access to your management server. These certificates and keys, they're still good. And so they hadn't even revoked those. Going on still, Microsoft releases their second patch on April 10th, which promptly gets bypassed again by Orca. And finally, in May, both companies released blog posts saying that this appears to be mitigated. Notice I'm not saying resolved or really fixed. In fact, Orca is kind of holding firm, at least up until last week, that this has not really been addressed, that there's still some risks here underlying the vulnerability. And we'll talk about that in a minute. on the technical side. Though Microsoft did say that they've actually finally, this week, they've saying they finally fixed the underlying issues. It goes on to, the article on the Register goes on to talk about Tenable's issues with reporting vulnerabilities to Microsoft, again, related to Azure Synapse. And Tenable CEO Amit Yoran was given his opinion that Microsoft has a pattern of dragging their feet when it comes to responding vulnerability reports, and Yoran and Orca Security both made comparisons to AWS and how AWS handles things, and Microsoft definitely came out not looking good in that comparison there, as they're talking about things being fixed within 24 to 48 hours on AWS, and in this case we're at 5 months before this issue is really resolved in Azure. So you have that side of this, but where I dug into this was really the blog post by Orca Security, because they published their technical write-up, and I've got this in the show notes to take a look at as well. They go through the dates on when things happened, as well as the steps it took them to go from a small initial vulnerability to now accessing other customers' data. And, so it was really wild to take a look at. So just as some background, Synapse basically is a workspace that allows customers to hook up different data sources and, run code to access those 8 data sources all in one spot. And just built into just kind of this microservice, if you will, that does this. Synapse basically, Synapse has the ability through the Azure management controls, that Microsoft has. They can access multiple customers' data. That's probably not a terrible surprise with a cloud platform. It's really that segregation that we're expecting to see happen. But Orca found a vulnerability basically in their SAML authentication plugin that allowed them to execute a shell command on their own system. Now, this was on their own system, so this isn't terribly exciting, but why is it executing a shell command? They kept chasing this down. They found out that they could get their own integration, that if they renamed their own integration environment from integration runtime 1 to auto resolve integration runtime, that elevated their access alone to getting access to Azure owned systems, not their system. And it was executing as NT authority system account, which, is a little over provisioned there, shall we say. And they got access to a client certificate that then turned around and allowed them to authenticate to the management server. And the management server, of course, has this very broad view into everything that's going on. And this is an Azure management server. And so now they're able to pull data from other people's runtime environments. And so this is a much bigger issue. The access vector came down to an ODBC connection string to do the code execution. So Microsoft's first example is, okay, fine, you reported it as using a connector named generic ODBC for your attack. We'll just disable that. And so they disabled that one connector. The problem was there's several other connectors that use the same underlying method. There's a method called generic ODBC connector that is behind generic ODBC, but it's also behind Microsoft Access and Informix and some others. And so all they had to do to bypass this was say, okay, well, we'll just use the Informix or the Microsoft Access connector, and boom, the exact same payload executes again. So Microsoft's response is, okay, we'll disable those connectors. Orca looks at the new code, sees what's going on, and says, oh, well, we've got this other method in here called generic ODBC partition connector instead of just generic ODBC connector. Let's see what happens here. And so they tried the exact same payload using that, and boom, that worked as well. This was finally at the point where Microsoft disabled anything that led to any kind of ODBC whatsoever. And this finally, and with some other things, according to Orca, killed their attack vector into this vulnerability. Notice, though, that, again, we're not addressing the underlying issue here of access to different tenant data. All we're talking about is the gateway in or a method of executing code. So theoretically, if you found a similar issue in one of these other connectors that were not ODBC, you would get the same thing going on again here and get access to this data. And that's really one of Orca's contentions here, is that the underlying issue isn't fixed. They don't have like sandboxing in place to separate tenant data and some other controls. And this is an architectural fix, and these things do definitely take some time to try and work out. And according to Microsoft, 5 months later, they have finally implemented something to take care of that. Now, we don't have any insight into what that is at this point. They just posted that this week, which it's Tuesday, so there's lots of week left. So we'll see if anything else comes up out of this. But it was definitely like I said, really interesting to watch how they went from okay, we executed a command on our local system or where we have our resources, not very interesting, to now we're accessing everybody's, and they just kind of kept pecking at that. So I covered that very lightly. If that is interesting to you, I would recommend taking a look at the blog post. Like I said, it's in the show notes, because they got into a lot more detail. Now, I can only imagine what some of the conversations were like at Microsoft as they're discussing this vulnerability, because I've sat in a few of these types of meetings where at some of my previous employers where we're talking about a vulnerability that needed to be fixed, and you've got folks who are pounding the table saying, no, we've got this this architectural issue, we need to resolve this, versus other folks who are trying some way to minimize this. They don't want to look bad to customers, so they come up with a quick, they start looking for a quick fix, a Band-Aid, if you will, to put over the top of this, and it's not going to be sufficient. And so you have this debate that runs back and forth. And I suspect this is probably some of what was going on inside of Microsoft around this, until finally they appear to at least have gone out and addressed the underlying issues. In the end, it took 5 months to stop access to anybody's data via ODBC connectors. And then, another month after that to address the architectural issue underneath it. Is it really the case that they fix this? Well, we don't know. We will see. I'm sure more people are going to be looking at this. I would suspect Orca is going to continue playing with this, as well as others. But if this is like I said, if this is interest to you, I would recommend taking a look. This is kind of a pretty good step through of vulnerability research and how this stuff can pan out. So it's a fun read, and a little bit distressing to see some of the access could be happening with some, again, some architectural issues around segregating access between different tenants and making sure we don't have something can just access everything at will like this. So take a look.
All right. Thank you, Jason. A very interesting story. And finally, if you've never heard the Floppotron, well, maybe you should. There are videos. I'm not making this up. There's videos on YouTube about it. I'd seen it before, but there was a new story about it today. But basically, what if you took a bunch of IT equipment and then made the sounds that those devices make, and like floppy drives and hard drive motors and so forth, and then you make up tunes and music that are played by this, and then you develop software that allows you to program this to make music. I mean, this is the Floppotron 3.0 has floppy drives, hard drives, got flatbed scanner motors, all kinds of other stuff. And they've added like LED strips to it. You can program the whole thing. I don't know if it's Ableton enabled, but could it be any cooler? And by cooler, I mean nerdier. But that's the new cool, right? I mean, wow. I mean, he even added MIDI support to this. And if you don't know what MIDI is, it's like a way of controlling, well, any kind of device, but it's particularly targeted at music devices. I mean, it's definitely an interesting video. Check it out if you want to have some real nerd fun. And that's the news. Thanks, Jason. See you Friday for the wrap-up show.